It, it's great to be back at Havelock United Methodist Church. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Pam Savery, and I do work here in the Lincoln District office, and I am very pleased to be with you again this morning. I have one announcement, and that is that we know that you will be receiving a new pastor, Todd Cargus, next week, and I want to remind everyone that there will be a welcoming breakfast for him and his family, and that is at 9:15 next Sunday, July 1st. So I hope that as many of you as possible can be here to welcome him and greet him. I should say a word about your incoming pastor. I realized in preparing for today that I think the first time I spoke here at Havelock was when you were between pastors right before Pastor Amy came to you. And I filled in for a couple of weeks right before she arrived. So it seems kind of fitting. I feel like bookends, to her ministry, because here I am once again at her leaving. But I want to share, even though I have not yet met Todd Cargus, I'm looking forward to that very much. Todd is somebody who is kind of from a family of pastors that are pretty well known throughout Nebraska. His father, Gil Cargus, was a pastor. He is a pastor. His brother Kelly is a pastor. His brother Casey is a pastor. Kelly's wife is a pastor. So they have a whole family of clergy and have very dedicated family life in the life of the church. So he will be a great leader for your congregation, and I'm looking forward to his coming. Well, so this is a time of transition that we are in, and transitions are never easy. As much as we may love Todd once you get to know him, and I get to know him, we're still sad that Amy is leaving us so soon. But she's had a wonderful 3 years with you, and I'm going to miss her too, because I used to see her fairly often, and her husband worked in the building that the conference owns with me, and so I knew Todd quite well as well. And so there are lots of changes afoot. And many of you may know that the conference office is being consolidated now in Topeka, and that's to be completed early July. So by July 10th, I believe, is the last moving date for some of the people in my building out on 33rd and Superior to make that transition to Topeka. Now, some people are losing their jobs, some are moving their jobs, and some are finding others. And a couple are staying here in Lincoln and will work remotely with the conference, only going to Topeka on occasion for special meetings. So we're breaking up the team that's been in that building out on 33rd and Superior. How many of you have ever been there, just out of curiosity? Several of you. So those of you that have been there know what a wonderful place it has been for our staff to do its work. And it's in a beautiful kind of a pastoral setting. There's some vacant land around us. There's some water beside us. We've had the privilege of watching baby geese getting their feet wet this spring. We watched deer in the pasture across from the water in the evenings, crunching on the alfalfa out there. And I'm going to miss all those beautiful pastoral moments, as well as some of the other wildlife that we see. So, it's a time of change. We will also be moving our district office. And the Blue River District, which has been housed in the Nebraska Conference offices, will be moving to the old Faith United Methodist building at 33rd and Star here in Lincoln. That is now being used and called as Connection Point, which is the home of United Methodist Campus Ministries for UNL's East Campus. They also are providing a food pantry for students as well as people in the neighborhood. They are doing English language learner conversation groups. They are doing Bible studies. They have an after-school program for children and many, many more things that are enriching the life of the neighborhood. So I hope that as we move to that office later this summer, that you will come by and say hello and see where we are, and also become aware of the wonderful things that are happening in that building. We'll be fortunate to be a part of that ministry as well. I will keep in touch with you on when our move date is. We actually have to build some walls in the overflow part of the sanctuary at Faith. That's where we're going to be. It would be as if Bill and I, Reverend Ritter, were making our offices at the back of your space here, except it's not as big. So, but it will be wonderful. Well, there are lots of changes happening in the conference, in the district, and even in the broader church as we look at the polity of the church, and some big decisions will be made about our United Methodist denomination over the next year. So it's fitting this morning that our scriptures speak to us just at a time like this, when what we felt was solid and certain now feels a little uncertain and unknown. Our epistle reading from 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 13, that Laura read to us, speak to Paul's many challenges in his ministry and threats that he suffered personally. And yet in that passage, he sees and declares in these words the most hopeful good news of Christ and the endless love of God for each of us, even against all odds. You see, Paul is playing the long game. He's not caught up in the moments, tragedies, or challenges, but thinking about his long-term goal, and that is to bring the good news of Jesus Christ and the love of God to as many people on this earth as he can in the remaining days of his life. He has committed himself to that mission fully, and in Jesus' own words, to bear witness to the truth. And that truth is this, that we were created by a loving God to be a people of goodwill, capable of so much more grace and love and wholeness than the collective wrongs of this world would indicate, than the cruel crimes of every age, or our petty personal challenges and failings would suggest. With God's help, we are capable of transforming the present into something so much finer. And the promise of eternal life with that God, that is a great bonus. Now, this message of Jesus was meant for all peoples, of all religions and cultures, of people in all times and places. And of course, it has been passed down to us even today. Now, our gospel passage from Mark speaks to the power of our God through his Son, Jesus Christ, in one of the more astonishing stories that we'll find in the New Testament. You see, what led up to this story is that Jesus had been speaking near the Sea of Galilee to huge crowds all day. And the geography of the Sea of Galilee was that there are mountains that sort of surround it and make a kind of a natural amphitheater. And we're told at one point earlier in the chapters of Mark that Jesus was speaking on the shoreline and the people around him, and that amplified his voice. But he was getting pressed in by so many people that he put himself in a boat and pulled back into the lake a little ways so that he would have just a little room between him and the people who were listening. So Jesus has had a day of preaching, of healing, of sharing this good news. And yet we know, you and I know, that certain kinds of tasks take it out of us. I have heard many pastors say that, and I've come to realize this when I do lay speaking like this, that to prepare a message, to deliver it on a Sunday morning, and for some pastors who have not just 2 churches but 3, to deliver it over and over again. There's a certain energy that gets expended in doing that. And many pastors tell me that Sunday afternoon is definitely their downtime, and some need a good rest. In fact, I'm thinking I'm going to have a nap sometime today. But that is the very human side of us. We have certain limits on our energy. Now, in this story today about Jesus, we see the limits of his energy as well, because he's had this long day of teaching. And now we are told at the beginning of this passage that Jesus decides to go across the lake and to the other side where the crowds no longer are, because he needs some rest. We're told that he gets into the boat just as he is and falls asleep at the back of the boat in a fairly short amount of time. Now, I'm guessing he fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. Little wonder, then, that when a storm comes up, he can sleep right through it. Now, I don't know if that ever happens in your household. I've heard that sometimes from members of my family. We'll be talking about, gosh, did you hear the storm last night? Oh, my goodness, the thunder and the lightning and the rain, and it woke me up, and it kept me tossing and turning all night. And somebody else in the same household will say, I didn't even hear it. And we've all had that experience, I'm sure. Well, this is one of those moments in Jesus' boat, because he's fast asleep and the disciples are wide awake. Now, the geography that I explained about the Sea of Galilee and the surrounding mountains had another interesting effect. Besides being a great amphitheater, a great place to gather people and be able to hear somebody like Jesus without a microphone, it also did something else. When weather patterns moved through that region of Israel, the harsh winds that came from the other side of these mountains would be transformed into really severe winds just by the geography, which pushed the winds, kind of magnified them, pushed them into a shorter, a narrower spot, and then they hit the Sea of Galilee with great force, so that even a more minor front might create a rather major disturbance on the lake itself. Now, Jesus' disciples, many of them were fishermen. We know this. We know that they fished in this sea, and they would have been very well acquainted with these storms. And still, this storm is really a tough one. It is so tough that when they are out in the water and the wind starts blowing and the waves start kicking up, pretty soon they're washing over the boat and the boat's getting swamped. And that's the point at which they wake Jesus up and they say, "Lord, don't you care that we're perishing? Don't you see what's happening here? Help, we need help." So that's the scenario we see. Now, I love the way the book of Mark tells this story, because biblical scholars tell us that Mark's account of Jesus and his ministry was the first of the four Gospels written. It was written about AD 65, excuse me. So just 30 plus years after Jesus was active in his ministry. Now, the defining quality of Mark's Gospel is that his direct source for stories about the life of Jesus and his ministry, including this one, was the Apostle Peter himself, one of Jesus' most devoted disciples, and the one on whom he gave the commission to found the church. And he said, "Peter, you are a rock, and on this rock I will found our church." So Peter became a very influential teacher, along with Paul, who never met Jesus until after the resurrection. And Jesus made an appearance to him on the road to Damascus. So he was converted by this lightning bolt experience of meeting Jesus. But Peter had his conversion over a long period of time, of walking with Jesus, of working with him, of seeing all these amazing things that Jesus did and hearing his teachings. Well, Mark became the person who wrote these things down. Most people in that time did not have the education or the background to write these stories themselves. the traditions were mostly oral. And so Mark, being an educated young man and a member of a prominent Jerusalem household where Christianity took hold early, his mother, we're told, was a very prominent early Christian. So Mark has this great background, and he's obviously been educated because he is able to write. We are told that he accompanied the Apostle Paul as well, along with his uncle Barnabas, on some of the earliest journeys that Paul took throughout the Middle East to establish churches, and that Mark was their aide and their secretary or their clerk. So he had a front row seat to an amazing education, both from the Apostle Paul, from his uncle Barnabas, and from Jesus' disciple Peter. Now, in this story, we have two little fragments of information that aren't really so terribly important, except that they give us an insight that we didn't have from the way this story is told in the book of Matthew and Luke. Just two little phrases. Mark notes that Jesus entered the boat just as he was. That phrase is missing from the other accounts of the story. Now, just as he was implies to me that there was little preparation for this journey, that it came about kind of quickly, and Jesus didn't have time to change clothes or have a sandwich or, do anything to prepare for this journey across the lake. He was just exhausted and needed to be someplace quiet. But this phrase that he was put in the boat just as he was, that seems to imply that the person saying it was there. And indeed he was. Now, the other thing that this story says that is just a minor detail also, but the other stories all say that Jesus was asleep in the stern, the back of the boat, the most rear part. And that was a place of honor for any passenger on a boat. But Mark also mentions that he was asleep on a cushion or a pillow, as some translations say. Now again, it's just a small detail, but something that someone who was there might have noticed. What other purpose does that information have except to reveal what Peter himself saw? So he's in the boat with Jesus. Now, Mark's gospel is filled with stories from Peter, who was awed by the Christ that he had come to know. We find more emotion in the stories of Mark and the disciples' reactions to their journeys with Jesus. So what meanings can we pull from this story today? It illustrates to us both the fullness of Jesus' humanity and his divinity. On this occasion and many others, Scripture tells us that Jesus withdraws from long days of preaching to rest and renew himself, physically and spiritually. Now, Jesus sleeps through this storm out of sheer exhaustion. He is, after all, like us in this way, because he is fully human, and this shows us that part of his character. But as the fear of his companions in this boat rises with the ferocity of the storm, Jesus exhibits his divine power by speaking to the wind and waves directly and calming the sea. What a remarkable thing, and we have not seen that in the Gospels before. It is more of an amazing feat than just the healing stories that we are used to hearing previous to that. Now, if all we want to do is focus on the reality of this story as a literal story, it's impressive that Jesus can command the wind and the waves, be still, and have them obey. It gave his disciples a great insight to the fullness of his power and his divinity. But there's another meaning we can take from this, and that is when we ourselves are caught in the overwhelming storms of our lives, that Jesus also is with us. In this metaphorical sense, we can be as close to him today as the men were in that boat. He is with us. He has promised that through good and bad, that he will always be with us. And that is something we can count on. Christ does not promise us that there will be no storms, but he promises that he will never leave us. Sometimes that's hard to imagine. I have a sister-in-law who's been through a couple years of health problems, and she had a difficult knee replacement, which left her with some chronic pain and some other things that trouble her. And her focus sometimes gets very negative, and she'll say, I don't feel like God even remembers me. I think he's forgotten me. I have to reassure her that that is not the case and remind her that God is with her through all of these things and wants only good for her life. Nevertheless, storms come, and we have to weather them. As I was preparing for this talk, I found the following blessing that I'm going to read to you. It comes from a book called Circle of Grace by Jan Richardson. And it's called Blessing When the World is Ending. Look, the world is always ending somewhere. Somewhere the sun has come crashing down. Somewhere it has gone completely dark. Somewhere it has ended with the gun, the knife, the fist. Somewhere it has ended with the slammed door, the shattered hope. Somewhere it has ended with the utter quiet that follows the news from the phone, the television, the hospital. Somewhere it has ended with a tenderness that will break your heart. But listen, this blessing means to be anything but morose. It has not come to cause despair. It is simply here because there is nothing a blessing is better suited for than an ending. Nothing that cries out more for a blessing than when a world is falling apart. This blessing will not fix you, not mend you, not give you false comfort. It will not talk to you about one door opening when another closes, but it will simply sit itself down beside you among the shards and gently turn your face toward the direction from which the light will come, gathering itself about you as the world begins again. I love those words. Sometimes when I'm thinking about all the overwhelming things happening in the world, and even the changes that are coming this summer for me and my office and my coworkers and the district superintendent, sometimes it's when I'm watching the news and there's something deeply troubling, I feel overwhelmed. But then I remember who loves me and whom I serve, and he has promised that he will never leave me to face my troubles alone. He offers that gift to all of us and to each of us. Amen.